Well, let's resume our conversation here, and we will hear from Richard. That's, as I mentioned, he manages, edits Brazil Confidential. Just one thing before, I'm very glad that Claudio mentioned Percio Arida's work here in the 80s. Yes, he, yes, Percio Arida was just out of MIT, where he had completed his PhD, and he came to the Wilson Center to start reflecting on hyperinflation, how you tame this beast. And we claim at the Wilson Center that what became later the Real Plan had its intellectual foundation in this work that was developed by Percio in collaboration with Claudio, in collaboration with so many people. And I use this just to give you a notion, because if you think that all what we do at the Wilson Center is what we are doing today, and we do a lot of conferences like that, many, but the substantive work is the work done by scholars, and there are plenty of those here in this building right now that presented their proposals, were selected, and came here, and they come here for different periods of time, but they work and produce work with the idea of improving the quality of public policy. I can think of few projects that had such an impact from the Wilson Center on as the discussions that were held at the Wilson Center, at the Castle initially, and then here regarding the stabilization program that was very successfully implemented in 1994 in Brazil under the leadership of then Finance Minister Fernando Henrique Cardoso. I remember that time, I think Sergio was serving as Deputy Minister of the Environment, and later he would become Minister of Development, Industry and Trade in Brazil. But just to highlight to you, you know, we do those, we convene conferences to share the knowledge, to really keep people thinking about improving the quality of public policy, but there is behind all that a very essential work done by scholars here. Percio Arida, mentioned by Claudio, is an example. He now manages, or is the CEO or the chairman of BTG, largest independent investment bank in Latin America, and has a very major partner in a Chinese investment bank. With that, I would like to invite my dear friend, Richard Lapper, to present the findings of the work that he has been doing at Brazil Confidential, and then we will be joined by Sergio, Claudio, and Erin and Nelson here for a conversation. Thank you very much, and for your questions also. Thank you very much. Richard.
Thanks. I guess you're all very glad that I suggested that we have the coffee before I speak. Thought there's more chance of you actually listening to what I was going to say by doing that. Anyway, good morning to everyone, and thanks for coming. The opportunity to tell you about Brazil Confidential, some of the research we've done on Brazil's relationship with China, and maybe to pull together some of the threads from the excellent presentations we've heard this morning from Sergio, my good friend Sergio, Claudio, and Nelson. Let me start, though, by telling you a bit about Brazil Confidential. I think I can ask you to, I can try and indulge your patience a little bit more now. In May 2009, we at the Financial Times launched our first venture, really, into independent research for investors. Very different to journalism. I mean, we're looking at a quite a different kind of information. It does include journalistic method, but it's principally based on data. During 2010, as China Confidential started to grow, we got a lot of inquiries from our customers asking us about Brazil. which, as you remember at that time, was something of, as Brazilians put it, a bola da vez in financial markets. And so we worked on a product that we launched last year. And we focused on analysing the fact, I should say at this point, that we're also at the confidential research team at the FT looking at other emerging markets. We plan to launch a ASEAN Confidential in March 2013. And later next year, we're hoping to start our first ventures in South America and in Africa, importantly. Now, in Brazil, we've focused on analysing the factors that have underpinned Brazil's transformation over the last 2 decades and that make it interesting and attractive to investors. I suppose this can be boiled down in essence to 2 things. First, the new trade relationships and dynamics, and especially the China relationship, and the way that has led to a revaluation of Brazil's traditional comparative advantage in resource industries. That has helped Brazil stabilize its external sector, particularly in the first part of the 2000s, and it set the scene really for transformation in the internal market. It's helped stabilize Brazil in many ways, which I'm sure we'll go into a little later. Second, the second factor we're focused on is the very rapid expansion, all related together, this very rapid expansion of Brazilian consumer markets, and especially the quick progress of the poorer regions of the northeast, the north, or the traditionally poorer regions, I should say, the north, the northeast, and the centre-west. Now, we research these things essentially in 2 ways. We interview extensively and in depth at all levels in all regions in Brazil, and we collect and analyse data. Since the beginning of this year, we've been conducting a sample survey each month of 1,000 Brazilians across Brazil, quizzing them about their financial situation, their willingness to spend, and general level of confidence. This is a weighted sample. It's quite a big sample. It's a weighted sample according to social class and gender, and we're picking up within this a lot of Class C Brazilians and how they are beginning to consume. And in addition, we survey brand preferences. So we look at a particular sector each month, and we look at which brands are making the grade in areas like cosmetics, body care products, of which Brazil's probably going to be, by 2015, the biggest market in the world, bigger than the US as a cosmetics market, very surprisingly, and that's because of the high propensity of Brazilians to spend on cosmetics and shampoo and things like that. We've looked at soft drinks, we've looked at private education, we've looked at cleaning products. We've got an upcoming report on the delightful subject of retail hygiene, as it's known, which includes toilet paper. We've got public transport. We've got all sorts. This is very nitty-gritty stuff. We're also building up other surveys based on interviews with panels of industry specialists, businessmen and women, bankers, politicians. Our labour market survey, we interview each month more than 40 recruitment agencies, and we're planning to monitor infrastructure developments in the same way by talking to suppliers. Let's turn now to what we've done on China. Now, this is hardly surprising in view of what we've also heard this morning. And when we devoted our launch issue to the Brazil-China relationship in October last year, clearly we weren't surprised to discover the extent of the growth of trade. It's been commented on already. It was well known at the time. It's been commented on today. Obviously, trade has burgeoned since the beginning of the 2000s, and particularly in the resource sectors for Brazil's exports. We also noted in that report, and we've had some more up-to-date figures in Claudio's presentation today on the 2011 picture there, but how much investment was growing and driven by the need to, principally in this early stage, by the need to secure control of resources. But we actually entitled our report last October, China's Industrial Foray, because the really striking thing for us was how much Chinese SOEs were interested in Brazil's market. SOEs were interested as exporters, but we detected growing interest among Chinese companies in directly investing in manufacturing plant. And we found that in sectors like motorbikes and air conditioning, companies such as Gree which makes air conditioning, and Zhongshan have been big players for a while. China's got a very, very significant market share. I mean, it has 60% of the Brazilian air conditioner market. China's Lenovo is a force in the personal computer market. Companies such as Zoomlion and Sany are winning share of the construction equipment. They make diggers and things like that. And car companies, at this point, this is last October, remember, were driving big time into the motor market. We knew from our conversations with our colleagues at China Confidential that in some sectors, notably construction materials and equipment, it was tougher conditions at home that were one of the big factors driving Chinese interest. Many SOEs are cash rich, but rising labour and other costs are making domestic projects relatively less attractive. And with that official push abroad that we've heard about this morning playing its part, there was a big interest in going abroad. The indebtedness of Chinese local governments meant that in some areas in construction there was just less business to go round. So all that set the scene for a lot of Chinese interest in the Brazilian market. And here we see in cars between 2008 and 2011, Chinese car makers such as Chery, one of the independent car makers that makes its own engines and transmission belts, built up a share of more than 2% of the, this is the overall Chinese players, made 2% of the Brazilian auto market by 2011. Much of this was achieved by imports, but we also found last summer that 3 Chinese motor companies were enrolling plans to build factories, and 2 others had similar investment plans in mind. Now, these advances were so dramatic that they prompted huge concern from local manufacturers and led to a wave of what can be loosely described as protectionist activity. Now, already a number of anti-dumping measures have been taken by Brazil aimed at Chinese producers in areas such as textiles. And in September last year, with the motor industry clamoring for help in the face of the rapid growth of Chinese market share and importantly, big falls in prices, there was a big increase in what's known in Brazil as the industrial products tax, and it was imposed specifically on imported cars and specifically on imported cars from Asia. And at a stroke, the size of total sales taxes on Chinese cars was increased by 50%. That increase has been accompanied by other tariff rises and a much stiffer import inspection regime, which goes by the name of Red Tide, just to leave no one in any doubt as to who the target is. At the same time, there's been, as far as we're aware, no progress in easing the rules surrounding the purchase of land by foreigners, a restriction that had been tightened to stop planned Chinese purchases during 2010. The Chinese were planning to build large tracts of land, including one 30,000-hectare stretch in Tocantins in the north of the country, until that ban was introduced. And it goes back to reinterpreting a law that is on the books since 1971. Now, over the last year, we've been monitoring things fairly carefully. And in August, my colleague Henry Mance was interviewed a number of the companies he'd first met in 2011, a number of Chinese companies. And in some ways, what we found was quite salutary. The IPI tax has certainly had a massive impact on Chinese car producers. Now, although Chery and other companies dodged the initial impact, they did, as this graph so clearly points out, lose ground. Things became worse when they were excluded from the set of incentives, tax reductions that were announced earlier this year. So that in June, Chery's sales fell 17.3% month on month, while the overall market surged ahead by nearly 25%. Now, this shows you very clearly, you can see the top of that graph, those black and green lines, when Chery and JAC were in their pomp in a way, August 2011. It's really fallen off big time since then. They've lost significant market share. Chery's back to where it was 2 years ago. The car maker accounted for 0.3% of all cars and light commercial vehicles sold in Brazil in August, the worst showing since September 2010. Now, possibly influenced by this decline, all the Chinese companies that we've been talking to have had problems with their distributors. Two manufacturers, JAC and a company called Chang'an, have put plans to build car plants on hold as they evaluate the impact of local content rules. There are other knock-on effects as well. Consumers are confused about whether Chinese manufacturers will remain in Brazil in the long term. And that's quite important because consumers in Brazil are wary of buying cars from companies that may leave the country because it will make it harder for them to service and resell their vehicles. It's still widely remembered in Brazil that Lada, which entered the Russian company, you may remember, that entered the car market in 1990 but left it in 1995. So that's also been a bit of a problem. But it's not just cars that have been affected. Asia Pulp and Paper, which is a Chinese self-evidently pulp and paper company, has put off plans to invest. China Construction Bank's advisors claimed it was blocked from buying assets belonging to West LB of Germany by the Brazilian Central Bank. The assets were eventually bought in June by a Japanese group. Chinese companies seem unlikely to qualify for the big Sao Paulo-Rio bullet train project. A year ago, everyone was saying that they're in line. The rules have been changed, and it looks now as though Chinese companies won't be able to qualify. And it's perhaps interesting that China does not feature highly in the areas where Brazil is seeking to pick manufacturing winners. Now, there are 4 areas that APEX, the Brazilian Investment Agency, is targeting. Electric equipment, thermoconductors, medical devices, aeroplanes, and renewable energy. And China really only has comparative advantage it's only seen as a potential partner in the sort of renewable energy field, where it's a big producer of wind farm equipment. They produce those big mills and so on, big windmills. Now, not surprisingly, the Chinese are complaining that the Brazilian investment environment could be more open, stable, and transparent. Now, if you scratch beneath the surface, however, things are not all that bad. So I've been listing all the problems, but actually, you know, underlying all this, things are not that bad. In trade, we've had this year a continual advance in Brazilian exports and Chinese exports to Brazil, with the value-added exports, such as aircraft, chicken, which is bizarrely a value-added export because it includes grains and so on, and leather, big increases in those products compensating, remember this is Brazilian exports to China, compensating for the decline in iron ore and in iron ore prices, certainly other mineral prices. So we've had a fall in as this graph shows, I think, oh no, it's not the right thing. Anyway, we've had a fall in commodity exports, but a rise in value-added exports as far as Brazil's concerned. As far as China's concerned, their exports, I think it's already been pointed out once today, but they grew by 8.6% to 22 billion in the first 8 months of this year. And electronic products heading the list we went to a trade fair in Brazil last month and saw several hundred suppliers of things like electronics, car parts, other goods pitching for business in Brazil. So, you know, Chinese exports of flat iron and steel grew by 8% in the first 8 months of this year. So it's not that bad a picture from a trade point of view. China, as this graph shows, remains, as Sergio Manuel already pointed out, Brazil's top trading partner if you disaggregate the various countries of the European Union. Certainly it's bigger than the US, importantly, and has been since 2009. Now, what about investment? What about investment? Nothing like the overall headline numbers in 2010 and 11, perhaps, but a steady stream of announcements and investments nonetheless. Sany, the construction equipment company, is continuing with a plan to invest $200 million. Lenovo has just made, this year has announced investments of about $430 million. It's bought up a Brazilian rival called Digibras. We've had announcements from two Chinese truck makers, Foton and Sinotruck, for about $500 million. In the oil sector, there's quite a lot of activity from Sinochem and Sinopec, which have been busily buying up minority stakes, often from, quite interestingly, from European companies. So Sinopec spent nearly $5 billion on a 30% stake in a Portuguese company called Galp, in buying a bit of the pre-salt. This is quite interesting, I think, because it puts them in a good position to deepen their involvement when there's an oil round, and oil blocks will be auctioned, probably going to be next year now. So China's well positioned in oil, and it's been gradually increasing its involvement through these minority stakes. Another thing that's important is that Chinese financial institutions are laying down the basis for further large investments. So China Development Bank is already offering finance to large Chinese corporations active in Brazil. Bank of China's got a license to operate in Brazil. The ICBC has gained approval for a license and has now got a big office on Faria Lima in Sao Paulo, employs 40 people. Now, we found that when we interviewed some of China's biggest companies, they were no less committed than they had been a year ago. I mean, State Grid, a very good example, Chinese utility. It's one of the biggest electricity utilities in the world. It already has assets of about 4 billion reais in Brazil, and it made its first acquisition in May 2010. This year, it's made two further acquisitions, both from European companies, heavily indebted, seeking to reduce their leverage. So again, Chinese companies taking advantage from the retreat of European, especially Southern European companies. These are Portuguese and Spanish companies that sold their transmission arms in Brazil. This year alone, State Grid spent $1 billion, and it plans to invest up to $5 billion by 2015. And interestingly, it plans to it's a transmission company, State Grid. It's going to get into generation. The same is true about a company called Huawei, which, as this graph shows, is increasing its revenue base in Brazil quite steadily over the past 3 years. That last figure, 2 billion reais, is for the first 8 months of, no, it's a forecast for 2012. Big investments again have been made by Huawei. It bought I think $300 million on an R&D center in Campinas in 2011, and a further 120 million investment in a distribution center in a place called Sorocaba in Sao Paulo State this year. The interesting thing I think about Huawei is that it's not just interested in the classic kind of low margin business that attracts Chinese companies, but it's looking at higher value added products. 1/3 of its sales in Brazil come from mobile phone handsets, and it told us about its plans to develop a new line that will be specifically targeted and is a kind of premium handset for the Brazilian market. Now, going back to the car sector, Chery, this is a model called the QQ, I think, has actually accelerated its plans to build a factory in Brazil. This is its first complete operation outside China, which is not a CKD, an assembly where they basically import the parts and put them together. This is all going to be sourced. A lot of these things are being sourced in China. The ground at a site in a place called Jacaraí, which is in Sao Paulo State, has been leveled. And we talked to these guys in August, and around 1/4 of the 14,000 pegs that they need to lay for the foundations are actually down now. So this is a factory that's used to start production in 2013. Chery aims to produce and sell 150,000 cars domestically by the end of, well, can't be by 2013, it must be 2015, I think. Chery has certified 5 suppliers in Brazil, and plans to, these are all Chinese companies, and it plans to attract other companies to help supply the factory. It's got 108 dealers, up from 95 last September, so it's actually increasing its commitments and its stake in Brazil. And it is looking at the possibility of opening a financing operation to help it sell cars to Brazilian consumers. Now, once the factory is in operation, Chery will be able to compete strongly in the entry-level segment. It's cheap cars for Class C consumers buying their first car very often. Margins will be slim, but the company's price and its improving technology should make it a pretty central player. So, in other words, we've had a big setback, but rather than sort of walk away, there seems to be strong evidence that at least one of the three players that was going to build a factory is certainly going ahead with it. And I think that's a pattern that's important. I think this is that if you're faced with the pressure that you can't export to Brazil without facing these barriers, then set up. And that's what the Chinese seem to be doing in some very important cases. We've seen Huawei, State Grid, and Sherry. Now, in conclusion, we reckon that the difficulties of the last 18 months represent bumps in the road rather than any kind of decisive reverse in the Brazil-China relationship. The long-term factor driving closer ties, the long-term factors driving closer ties remain intact. Now, Brazil's comparative advantage as a producer of food, minerals, and energy, and long-term Chinese demand for these resources, that's going to stay intact whether or not, and I think I completely agree with what Claudio's saying about Chinese growth. I mean, it's not going to continue at 10%, but nonetheless, if China grows at 7 to 8%, and our guys on China Confidential are predicting 7.8, maybe they've done that just to keep the 8 in there, but 7.8% there is my colleague James King call on Chinese growth, 2012. If it keeps growing at that rate, it's still going to be pulling in a lot of resources. Basically, this long-term industrial revolution that's going on in China and elsewhere in Asia is going to continue. I mean, we're getting a huge move from rural areas to urban areas. That's going to continue. The attractions of the Brazilian consumer market for Chinese manufacturers are also going to be there. So we think that China's in Brazil to stay. And that's where I will conclude. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to invite Sergio and Aaron and Nelson, Claudio, and Richard to come up. While we're coming here, I have a question for you. If you have been to São Paulo, how many of you have been to São Paulo? Okay, now you can answer me privately, please. You can give it. Where are we going to put 180,000 cars? And then, in addition to all the hundreds and thousands of
But
cars,
they'll be very small cars.
yes, yeah, they will fit our very small streets. So it's going to be. If you have an answer, please.
Você não vai sentar aqui comigo?
No, I'm going to stay here, and you guys are going to be there. Now, thank you very, very much. I am now to introduce, I'm going to introduce you the participant that is joining us now. And it's a pleasure to have Erin Ennis. She has been Vice President of the U.S.-China Business Council since 2005. In that position, Erin directs the Council's government affairs and advocacy work for member companies and oversees the Council's business advisory services. She also leads a coalition of other trade associations on issues of interest of companies doing business with China. You have her bio here. She has a past association also with Kissinger McClarty, that company. There was a moment when Kissinger and McClarty operated as one company. So she is very much at home here in this panel. And I would like to invite Erin to go first, and then we will engage in a conversation, because I think Erin could give us a little bit of a perspective of the current priorities of the Council, the U.S.-China Council, given what we have seen in the headlines lately, very difficult challenges involving especially issues of national security. And then we are going to open up and try to compare a little bit how the experiences of American companies in China, Brazilian companies in China, how do they compare, and also of Chinese companies doing business on both countries. So with that, Erin, why don't you give us a little overview of the Council's priorities right now? Thank you.
I will be brief, since I know that there's probably many more interesting things to be said than what I have to say, but thank you very much for having me. We recently released, actually just Wednesday, our most recent survey of our member companies on what their business operations in China look like. So the points that I have today are based on very new data. We poll our companies every year. We've got about 230 US companies that are doing business with China. That's importers, exporters, and companies that are engaged in two-way trade. The number one thing that probably I always start with when I make these remarks is that this is still a growing market for US companies. Most of our companies are telling us that they grew by at least 10% in 2011. In general, through the global recession, China was one of the few bright spots for most of these companies. So it was one of the few areas that allowed many US companies to be profitable at all in 2009 and 2010. That growth is moderating now. When you ask companies about the comparison of growth rates of their China operations versus their global operations, they're now getting a little more into what we saw prior to the global recession, but still growing. 10% is a pretty robust growth rate for a company across the board. But I would say that that growth has been tempered by some really difficult challenges in the market. You can label it whatever you want. The rise of the Chinese state-owned enterprise, the fact that there's industrial policy there. The fact is none of these are new challenges for US companies in China. We have seen largely the same problems for companies over the 7 years that we've been doing this polling. And in general, at the top of the list is always a challenge that has nothing to do with bilateral trade at all. It's human resources. As much as we think that 1 billion people means that you have an endless supply of labor, the people who are employable in a large multinational company tend to be a much smaller pool, and that pool, particularly in the first-tier cities, is largely tapped out. Many companies will tell you that their prime prospects for employees comes from their competitors. We did an event about 2 years ago where we were discussing with our companies just hiring for government affairs jobs in China, and I asked the 20 companies around the table how many of them had hired someone away from another company at the table in the past year. And I kid you not, 10 hands went up. 10 companies had poached from another company in that room. Some of them may have been poaching multiple times. I didn't ask that part. But that is a very serious challenge for our companies. And you see that in the costs that are rising across the board as well. Rising labor costs are the top. And that's not just for white-collar professionals. That's for people working in factories. That's for the engineers that are working in R&D facilities. So it is in itself a constraint on growth for companies. You get down past those just market dynamic challenges, though, and you do start getting into areas where there's a strong sense from companies that they are dealing with an unlevel playing field in China. The challenges that they deal with in getting licenses for their business, the challenges in whether they are inspected at a more frequent rate than their competitors, whether their products have to go through a higher level of scrutiny, whether there are just simply restrictions that bar them from being in areas that their domestic competitors are not barred from. That is starting to have an impact on how companies are perceiving the market. While we've only seen a slight decrease in the number of companies who tell us that their plans for investment in China were either curtailed or halted altogether in the past year, the number one reason they told us that they were doing that was because of government regulation. That's a significant change from what we've seen in the past. Most companies were planning to move ahead regardless of what the challenges were in that market. China's Ministry of Commerce reported last year that there was we've seen conflicting numbers, but somewhere between a 25 and a 28% reduction in US investment alone in the country. Our hope is that that kind of a decrease year on year would get enough notice within the government that perhaps there are some issues that they need to address, but we shall see. We're still early in that process. And sadly, when China released its most recent catalog detailing where foreign companies can invest in China, we did not see any significant increases, and we in fact saw some rollbacks in areas where we had hoped to see some progress. On the horizon, I think that companies generally are still positive about this market. We ask questions about how optimistic are you about this market, and then a look-back question of how optimistic are you compared to how optimistic you were 3 years ago. In general, companies still say they are planning to expand in this market. But that look-back question of compared to 3 years ago, pretty significant number of companies are telling us that the market is not as positive as they thought it was going to be. So we characterize it as tempered optimism. I think probably as policies continue to unfold and as a new government takes its place in China, companies are going to be evaluating how quickly they want to expand in that market and if there are going to be any new opportunities. With that, I'll stop.
Well, thank you very much. If I listened correctly, and from all the presentations, I see just a couple of common themes between Brazil, China, United States. One that has been highlighted about growing barriers to investment, all three countries. It's quite striking. The other one that Darren just mentioned, which is a common theme, I was less aware about the limits of supply of qualified manpower, which is a topic in the United States. It's an issue. It obviously is a major issue in Brazil. And I would invite then, maybe Sergio, you could start us off by, reacting a little bit to what you have heard and maybe to say something.
I think you made a very interesting point, and that's where both presentations coincide. I am not sure that there are growing barriers. Perhaps we might put it in another way. There's less interest. As I think Claudio mentioned, the time when China was looking for investment, when they needed desperately investment, were the 80s, perhaps the 90s. Now, perhaps they need less. That's one point. The other point in which both comments coincide is the problem of labor supply. And this coincides with the testimony of Brazilian companies working in China. Now, I think there is a point which may be behind the scene, which is, are these changes that are taking place in China consistent? And I think that if we consider the 12 plan, 5-year plan, which was announced, I think, last year or even before, to a large extent, China anticipated what's going on. When you read the press, China is declining, this is very worrisome. They said that. They said almost 2 years ago that they would like to reduce the growth rate from 10% level to a 7 to 8% level. So there's no surprise. Second, the reduction in growth is consistent with the change. Let's say, let's move from an export-led growth to a domestic consumption growth. So if you are to invest now, you are not going to invest necessarily in infrastructure, you are investing in consumer goods. And thirdly, there is indeed an increase in wages. This may affect the competitiveness of Chinese products abroad. But on the other hand, you are increasing the domestic market. If China is to move from an export-oriented growth to domestic growth rate, this changes what I think. That's my assumption, is that they are consistent. And this does not mean that China will be a less important partner, at least for Brazil. Because, and André from the Council noted one very simple fact. One thing is 10% growth from a reduced GDP. Another thing is a 7 to 8% growth in a GDP which, in the meantime, has grown consistently. So from the point of view of what we export to China, I think, that's also my assumption, there is no reason to be concerned. Because if they are growing less, on the other hand, they are moving 300 million people from the countryside to the urban areas, and they will need soybeans, they will need iron ore, and that's what basically we export.
Well, at the very beginning of this session, we had what I thought was a wonderful presentation by Stape Roy on the coming change of leadership there. And basically, one of the things that he highlighted is the fact that the crowd that is coming on board now to lead China, born in the 50s, people more internationally related, more probably more modern in their thinking. And do you, all of you, do you have any apprehensions, any questions about how the change, or any hopes in terms of how the change in leadership in China will affect business relations in the areas that you are working? Nelson.
I've got some thoughts on how the changing business climate in China is going to affect things. It may or may not have to do with the leadership change.
Okay.
But you know, as I noted at the top, we do a lot of work advising companies in both Brazil and China, as well as other parts of the world, and helping them deal with barriers to entry. And it's been evident to us for many years that, frankly, there's been let's just say some information exchange perhaps behind the scenes between some of these governments on how things might be managed. I'm not sure whether indigenous innovation began in China or began in Brazil, but there's sort of an interesting parallels between the way that both governments have sort of thought about ways to leverage foreign investment to increase their own domestic technology and innovation resources by creating rules that require foreign investors to turn over know-how, to share know-how, to develop know-how and products in their countries rather than just building things there that are made with know-how from someplace else. What's interesting to me now, and I think what allowed that to happen, was that in a world where the global economy was growing, the developed world was having its challenges, but India, China, Brazil, others were continuing to grow. It was possible for a China or for a Brazil to say, you know, people have to come to us. We're China, we're Brazil, everybody's interested in us. We can play a little hard to get. We can look to leverage foreign investment to our own advantage. I think the change that we see coming now, it's a variation of what Fareed Zakaria called the rise of the rest. Here, the rest isn't the rise of India and China or Brazil. The rest, I mean, is Indonesia, it's Malaysia, it's Peru, it's some of the smaller economies, it's Vietnam. Smaller economies that are coming up, they're watching, they've learned from Brazil, they've learned from China, they've learned from India, and they're now opening their markets more aggressively to foreign investment. So I think what we may see in the next decade is countries like Brazil or countries like China that have had such a lead on attracting investment and have been so appealing to foreign investors because they were, frankly, there weren't that many places to go that had big, attractive, interesting markets. They may find themselves now suddenly having to be more appealing, work harder to be more appealing to foreign investors, and maybe be able to leverage less what they think is their unique position for their own internal development.
Yes, Aaron.
I'll take on the what we think is going to be happening in China with the new team. The sources that we talk to within China's government have been telling us fairly consistently for several years that there's been a robust debate going on about what the direction should be of the economy in the years coming forward. And all indications so far, you know, assuming a smooth transition, assuming everything goes as we think it's going to be, is that those who have been advocating financial reforms are winning the battle, that the challenge is not going to be of proving that financial reform is necessary, that further opening is necessary of the markets, better liberalization, as you pointed out, the better creation of a domestic consumption. That's just going to be a means of how to do that. And an interesting indication of that is the World Bank's 2020 report that came out earlier this year. You know, that report didn't happen in a vacuum. It's not that someone miraculously had the idea. We should write a report about how China should reform its SOEs. Clearly, there was a desire for some outside analysis of what might be necessary to do those things. I think that that is a good indication that if you give the right fodder to those who need it, to say these are the reasons why outsiders, not the US government, not the Brazilian government, but others outside of this have analyzed where we are and where we need to go, and they're backing up that a reform strategy is in the best interest for our economy in the future. I think that you are then arming the allies to ensure that that financial reform continues.
Let me, okay, go ahead, and then Richard.
I would like maybe some of us, I guess all of us to an extent, including myself, are underestimating the complexity of the transition. Um, Ambassador Roy earlier this morning said something which is we know, but it's quite interesting as well. Treat China as a corporation, and let's look at the GDP growth rates as shareholders' return. And if GDP growth rates goes down, shareholders might be a bit unsatisfied. More than that, they'll start looking around and says, management didn't do such a good job in A, B, or C. It turns out that I think that we may, again, underestimating all of us, how fast China's growth rate might decrease and what kind of political problems this might pose, because at the end of the day, rising incomes and rising employment levels is the source of legitimacy for the government. I mean, I think this is the core source of legitimacy. It has to do with improving standards of living and so on. Now, you have to have a massive transfer. If you look at the rate of government consumption in China, is relatively low. If you look at the tax rate, tax burden in China, actually, for the level of income is okay, but I would say that's around nearly, I think, 13-14% below Brazil's. Brazil has a system, which I don't think is a great system, but let me tell you, it has a system, a very effective system of transfer, of massive transfer of resources to not only in terms of social security and employment and so on. So basically, and that provides an enormous amount of stability. It also provides some bad things as well, but on the good side is stability. China is beginning to emulate a system of transfers, setting up social security networks in rural areas and so on. At the same time, you have a very fast demographic transition. When you combine a very fast accelerated demographic transition as we're observing, with the need to set up a complex and costly, I would say, social security system, that will say there will be much less resources left for investment. So I'm just admonishing that maybe that we, in the transition, I think that from a strategic sense, the strategic goals, I think the leadership, knows where they want to get. The question is how to get from here to there. And in the meantime, if you have a deceleration of growth in the context of Europe that's not growing, not going to be growing next year either, and maybe who knows what's going to happen in 2014, and we're not sure about the US either. So in this context, how would the leadership react? If the very recent past is prologue, and I'm not sure if it is, you see, the way they reacted this year and last year is to do more of the same, basically. More investment, more this, more that, more credit. The challenge is how to move away from this model and do during the transition. So I don't have an answer to that. I'm just saying that there, as an upshot of all of this, could be rising nationalism, one. A more adverse attitude towards foreign direct investment. I'm not countering. I think that you have a new leadership with a more worldly outlook. But push comes to shove, what they have to do is to guarantee high growth rates. So they're going to look at their past as, what have we done in the past? Well, forget about the transition. I'm going, in the meantime, at least the next 2, 3, 4 years, when the world is there's so many question marks on the horizon, let me try to push more money into the system. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a tremendous tension between, on the one hand, liberalization and this kind of short to medium-term requirements to maintain high growth rates. And this could be a tremendous source, I would say, of nationalism. Maybe Brazil will continue to export, iron ore, soybeans, and so on. But the environment for investors in China could turn to the worst, depending on what kind of macro scenario they face.
Give Richard.
Just make 3 points, really. Firstly, I think that there's a tremendous tendency in Europe and the States to underestimate the complexity and sophistication of the political and institutional structures of places like China and Brazil and India. Sure, there are structural imbalances in these economies that are very severe and very acute, just as there are in Europe or the US in some ways. But those structural, just as in Europe and the US, those structural imbalances don't necessarily translate into acute political problems. I don't think they necessarily translate into political problems of a destabilizing character in China or Brazil. It's obviously mad to say there's going to stability is guaranteed in China, but nonetheless, I think that's a general point. Secondly, the world obviously is moving into a much slower growth environment, as the IMF recognised this week, right? I mean, this is not just it's everyone's going to be affected by this. The emerging world is going to be affected by it as much as well. It's just going to be slowing down from a higher base. And within that context, I think it's very important, certainly from a Brazilian point of view, it's very important to see that, we say that the new trade relationship's about China. Sure, it is about China. It's the biggest of the new partners. But actually, if you look at the pattern of Brazilian trade since 1990, what's really happened is that China and the rest and the other emerging markets have grown very significantly in overall trade patterns. So Brazil isn't just exporting to China. I mean, it's exporting huge. I mean, the biggest export market for Brazil foods is the Middle East. Brazil is exporting huge amounts to Africa, to elsewhere in South America. Remember, South American economies have also grown quite quickly during the 2000s, and Brazilian companies are very strong there. So you look at the rise of India, and again, it's going to be it's slowing down, but it's still growing, and it is going to be a source of demand for Brazilian commodity products. So I think that Brazil, I think it's a mistake to see Brazil and China facing necessarily competition from the sort of Vietnam, the Perus, the Colombias. I think what we're seeing is a kind of fundamental reorganization in which the emerging economies, and particularly those emerging economies that have large internal markets and political stability, will do well.
Okay. Sergio?
Yes, I'd like to pick up on what Claudio said, and I think that there's another point on which we all agree. It is the magnitude of the challenges facing China, because it's not only one transition, it's not only a political transition, it's an economic transition, it's a social transition, because there are challenges they all have to deal with. And one of them are the demonstrations at the local level. Since the society wants to open up and wants to participate, and the political system and the public opinion doesn't allow for participation, the control on public opinion, they demonstrate. And there's hundreds of demonstrations that take place in a week or in a month. And also the mobilization of internet as a way of participation. So this has to have a response. That's the main concern of the government now, and I think for the next leadership, moreover, is that this transition takes place with stability and control. These are the two basic assumptions for the new leadership in the area of transition. I don't think that what's at stake is liberalization of trade. I think I would say that the financial, as you mentioned, the financial system is perhaps a more pressing requirement. But what is important, the new leadership seems to be aware of the big issues. The challenge is how to implement this transition.
Mm-hmm. I would like to, Sergio, you said once something that I find very interesting and very true, that on commenting Brazil-China relations, you said somewhere that China, the interactions with China challenges Brazil in so many ways, and obviously one of them is precisely the challenge of competitiveness. It is. Do you think that Brazil is using this challenge well, is facing this challenge in a positive, in a productive way?
This takes us to your presentation, which I found very interesting. In other words, your presentation was the other side of my coin. I complained about some restriction in China, and I said, listen, pay attention, Brazil has many also. Now, the point, Paul, is that we of course, we value very much our cooperation with China, and we have some complaints. But we have to recognize that the fault is basically ours. We have a big deficit of competitiveness. As Claudio emphasizes very often, we have become a very high-cost platform for production, and we will have to cope with that. Now, how are we trying to solve this big challenge, this big Brazilian challenge? Unfortunately, I don't think the government has the capacity or has the willingness or doesn't wait to pay the political cost of the big reforms we know we have to accomplish. The tax reform, the labor reform, infrastructure. For instance, the government just announced a new system of concessions. But when you see the regulations, you see the concessions is one thing, but the implementation of those concessions will be extremely difficult. So the point is, to what extent we will be able to face our own challenge. And since, up until now, we have not been able to face problems with reforms which are required, we are doing a piecemeal approach. We increase the tax for imports, as you mentioned, EPE, for cars. We reduce or make tax exemptions for some specific sectors. This is, to a certain extent, is affecting our partners abroad. In the case of China, you mentioned the main examples. Now, the point is that this is affecting our partners, and this is not enough.
Mhm.
So we have a very big challenge, and as I normally say, China only dramatizes our deficits, and that's the deficit of competitiveness, and we don't still have an answer for that.
Now, question for Aaron and for Nelson. It looks like if you pay attention to the political campaign, to the presidential campaign, suddenly investing in China has become a very bad thing. People are accusing each other of investing there and creating jobs there in detriment of the United States. This is just until November 7th, and then we go back to something else. What is because you understand this town very well and American political reality. What is your take on that?
Want me to go first?
Go ahead first.
It is my prayer that this is until November 7th and that we don't have to worry about it anymore, but probably somewhat unrealistic. Certainly the presidential campaign rhetoric is at a level that we have not seen probably since maybe 1989, when post-1989 with Tiananmen. Clinton certainly raised a lot of it during his campaign, but very much from a different angle. The trade aspect, sadly, is nothing new. Americans, as much as we should be very proud of the fact that we are members of NAFTA, that we're a member of the WTO, that we finally got other FTAs through, the fact is that we have a love-hate relationship with trade. It is very difficult for most people to understand that the economic concept at play in trade is not that you have a pie that's being divided up in a certain number of pieces, but that by trade you're growing the pie. And I think that we do an adequate job when the problems come up to try to remind people that trade creates jobs, that a company having operations overseas does not mean that an equal number of jobs have been lost in the U.S., and that imports do not mean that we would have made it here otherwise. The nature of the U.S. economy is such that most of the things that we import from China are things that we haven't made here for years and probably wouldn't be making here if they weren't being made in China. They'd be made in Malaysia or Indonesia or elsewhere. But that is a very difficult concept to get across in a campaign. So I think we have to endure as best we can. We need to hope that perhaps the more nuanced message of why trade is important, not just with China, can get through and continue to fight the battle because it does benefit the economy.
Yeah. I think it's important, Paulo, to put this all in some context. For the last 4 years, we have been undergoing the most severe financial crisis and economic problem since the Great Depression. The United States economy contracted terribly from 2008 to 2009. We've had lingering unemployment. We have had substantial headwinds as a result of the fallout from the financial crisis. I think what's remarkable is how little protectionist activity there has been here in the United States. During the Great Depression, Smoot-Hawley came in, jacked tariffs up, and that helped lead to a worldwide spiral of contracting trade that prolonged the Depression for years. In this country, President Obama, although he's a Democrat, stepped in and has frankly taken many trade liberalizing steps, which would frankly look much more like what a Republican administration would do than what might have expected a Democratic administration to do. He immediately stepped up and said, I will pass Colombia, Panama, and South Korea free trade agreements. I will embrace the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks and expand them and drive them forward. I just got back from Brussels, where I met with some EU trade officials. The US, EU, FTA pre-negotiations are actually quite robust. We actually have an administration here that understands that expanding trade is terribly important. The President's export initiative, where he said by 2014 we're going to double exports. A lot of people scoffed at that, and guess what? We're actually on track to do that. So I think you have to put all of this in the context of saying in a terrible financial crisis, economic slowdown, we've actually been taking substantial steps to expand trade liberalization. One final note. I noted in my opening comments the CFIUS decision on Sani. This is the first time in 22 years that a White House has stepped in and blocked an investment by a foreign company. And a lot of people are saying, what in the world? This is a clear political move by the White House to show strength against Chinese imports, and this must be political. I did some looking into this. I've had a lot of experience on CFIUS. I think this has been way overinterpreted. This is first of all a tiny investment. This was 4 wind farms in Oregon, which does in fact have spectacular wind. It's some of the best windsurfing in the entire world is in Oregon, in the Columbia River. And these wind farms are in that area. It's a great place to have wind farms. The problem is it's also just right down from some very sensitive naval aviation facilities. And when the Chinese company made this investment, they declined to notify the CFIUS committee as they're required to. They were found out. There was a process undertaken. And as a senior government official who I spoke to just yesterday about this said, this is perhaps the stupidest Chinese company I've ever seen. Because they refused to accept that there could be legitimate national security concerns from being right next door to some sensitive naval aviation facilities. And rather than doing what most foreign companies do when they see that they are clearly swimming upstream on one of these national security issues, they pressed for a decision. Rather than just backing off and quietly going away, they pressed for a decision, and the decision they got was a negative one. But it's a tiny investment, it's very unique circumstances, and I think it would be a mistake to read more into this than anybody else did, although that did not stop the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago from reading a lot more into it than I think it deserved.
Well, I would like to offer you the chance to ask questions. Sir, just wait for the mic and identify yourselves, please, so they know who you are. Yes, right. We have questions. One here, one there. Yes. Michael, there is a... Make it... Yes. This gentleman here, please.
Hi, thank you. Raymond Barrett with PAR. Maybe a question towards is Aaron first. I'm just wondering how you view the U.S. business side of things versus the kind of national security hawks, we'd say, and their attitudes towards China and Huawei in particular. I suppose basically is how you balance access to China from the kind of, say, sales side of things, and then IP protection on the other side of things, and whether or not maybe the US business community fears some kind of retaliation for any kind of punitive kind of measures towards Huawei.
I guess, let me just say at the beginning, I mean, I think the points that Nelson raises are exactly right. We have a process in place when there are national security concerns that takes care of it. It's CFIUS, it is a well-known process. I'd put our foreign investment review process in its narrow scope and its relative transparency, as much as anything dealing with national security can be, up against almost any other review that foreign governments have, and certainly against similar reviews that occur in China. So I think that there's a process in place for these kinds of things. The report that came out this week on Huawei and ZTE, I read it. It was, I've been joking with several friends this week that it's almost like the business equivalent of Gary Hart back in '88 saying, if you think I'm cheating on my wife, then investigate me. Huawei set themselves up for this. They published a full-page ad in a newspaper and said, if you think that we have any problems, then investigate us. I will say that I think that there were some answers in that I think were probably sufficient. There were others which, you know, any company might not be as transparent on. There were definitely some concerns raised in that report, though, about kind of putting aside the national security issues at all. Definitely some very concerning allegations about IP violations, violations of U.S. visa laws, of U.S. labor laws, those kinds of things, and hopefully the appropriate channels will investigate those. As to whether companies are concerned about the impact, you know, our hope is that the government entities in China who control these things will recognize this is not about the U.S. and China. This is about two companies who may have practices that some U.S. government entities may have concerns about how those practices are being conducted, and that it is unique to those two companies. It is certainly not a statement about the U.S. views of any Chinese investment in the United States. If you look at the number of governors and mayors that are going to China and actively courting foreign investment in the United States, certainly that's got to be a better indication of what the broader sentiment is in the United States about foreign investment here. But you know, it's a matter of waiting and seeing. There's a certain amount of tit for tat on anti-dumping and countervailing duties. Some companies will tell you, those that are targeted feel it very, very acutely. But it doesn't hit every company that's doing business in China. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see.
Yes, there is a question right there.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and this is to Richard Nelson specifically, but anyone else. Going to the other side of this, there's really a lot of investment and exchange of technologies and products between Brazil, China, the United States, and the green space, as far as renewable energy, electric cars, and a number of other industries. And I just wonder what you see as far as the future of that, and also continued collaboration and research and development, particularly in the different types of batteries for electric cars and wind generation equipment and those types of activities. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for being here today.
Well, the obvious thing to say about, you know, the opportunities that, you know, Brazil represents. I mean, Brazil's ethanol industry has now, for, you know, about 75% of Brazilian cars have got flex fuel engines. It's probably the only example of any, you know, sort of car industry in the world that's that much geared towards green fuel, and that industry is in relative difficulties at the moment. But nonetheless, I think it represents, you know, the building it up represents considerable achievement. The main problem they have is being able to export ethanol, and this is the classic infrastructure problem that Brazil hampers Brazil's efforts. You know, I think it's worth pointing out that Brazil's green kind of profile is often not quite as, it doesn't get the credit it deserves. I mean, greens, you know, Brazil's energy mix is pretty green because of the, you know, the enormous weight of hydroelectricity. It's, you know, look at wind farm equipment, I suppose, and wind farms, alternative energy sources. It's a lot of stuff going on in those areas. I mean, it's obviously self-evidently the biggest in Latin America, but that's no surprise since it's the biggest economy. But it is actually, I think, a growing area, and one in which, you know, Chinese suppliers have played an important role on wind farms and so on. But yeah, I mean, the standout really is ethanol, and how Brazil, I mean, you know, how Brazil can actually seriously become some kind of green Saudi Arabia. They're a long way from that at the moment because it's purely domestic industry. But clearly it represents an example that, you know, is notable and
Okay,
Yeah,
now,
what we've seen, Paolo, on this is we've seen each of these three governments, Brazil, China, and the United States, have been working hard to try to give their domestic green energy companies an international advantage. So our stimulus bill here in the United States set aside billions of dollars to invest in green technologies, to invest in solar panels and wind turbines, other technologies. The Chinese stimulus bill did exactly the same thing. The Brazilians, Dave Nelson from GE just left, but GE has been very active down in Brazil in dealing with many of BNDES's stimulus initiatives, which are designed to promote their green technology sector. So all three countries have understood that they need to get ahead of this, and they're all working hard to do it. The problem they're facing, the problem that has occurred, is that the Chinese, frankly, did it so great and did it so in such massive amounts that they drove prices so low that nobody else can compete with them. And so you did have a big sector, part of the US sector, collapse, Solyndra being the most famous example. But you're now seeing the Chinese starting to cannibalize and eat each other. The Chinese wind turbine companies, the solar panel companies. The good news in all this, Paolo and Sam, is that, you know, we as consumers can benefit from this. You know, we can buy solar panels now to put on top of our industrial facilities in our homes at a fraction of what they were a few years ago, and frankly, probably at a fraction of what they actually cost to manufacture. And we can do the same thing with some of these alternative fuels, such as ethanol and others, which receive great government subsidies. So we as consumers should be happy that governments are racing to promote green technologies. I just wish that it were being done in a more sustainable fashion that wasn't just going to lead to lots of bankruptcies and people perhaps questioning green technologies instead.
Just take a shot at it, just a
Yeah.
1 minute shot. I think this is one area, I'm not sure if it's the sole area, but this is certainly one area where there could be a three-way collaboration between US, China, and Brazil. If you look at the amount of research and basic scientific research that's going on in Brazil in green technologies, and only ethanol, we did a recent study on this. There's a significant amount, you know, publishable papers in, you know, first-rate journals and so on and so on. Chinese have an active interest in this area. The US has an active interest there. We have an active interest. So what is missing here is some kind of institutional frame and firms which are willing to take this ball forward. You know, this is one area where I think there is a lot of convergence of interest, certainly in China, because they're seeing the tremendous cost of dumping, I don't know, 12, 13, 15 million cars a year now. You know, it's going to become the largest market in the world. In Brazil, in the US, of course, you have a long history, and you have a look at the, you know, there's a fairly active environmental policy. And in Brazil, we're also looking at the costs, not only direct on the environment, but also in terms of congestions of cities. So people are looking for ways to minimize the environmental impact and look into green technology. So this is, I think, is one area for a possible collaboration. I think there's an interest, but we have to, in a sense, have kind of a right frame for this to move forward anyway.
thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, Ben Hancock from Inside U.S. Trade. I had a two-part question. First, for Ms. Ennis, I think you mentioned that the number one reason for companies canceling investment plans was government regulation, and if I didn't misunderstand, there's also been a significant drop somewhat in U.S. investment into China. I wondered if it sounds like this investment relationship is somewhat underutilized, and I wondered if you could say whether that really is the case, and if so, why, and whether a bilateral investment treaty with China, like we're in the kind of beginning stages of now, would really be able to address some of the unique circumstances that China poses. Second piece, turning to Brazil, Mr. Amaral, maybe you could answer. You mentioned some of the difficulties and measures that Brazil has put in place, and as you're aware, it's just raised up, or has plans to raise up tariffs on 100 industrial goods. There's been an outcry from the U.S. about that, but I wondered, is this being seen primarily as really aimed at China and maybe has some kind of collateral damage vis-a-vis the U.S., and what the impact of that is? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Sure. I think a bit definitely would help. And I don't know that we necessarily need to be concerned as much about the unique challenges that China's market presents, because the revised model bit has disciplines in it that would address concerns that have been raised by many about state-owned enterprises. The basic tenets of the U.S. approach to bilateral investment treaties is one that would benefit companies across the board, pre-established, the ability to get around these investment restrictions that bar foreign companies from getting in the market, a negative list. So China's the second largest economy in the world, but is still trying to direct where people invest. A better way to see the kinds of financial reforms and transition that we were talking about earlier would be for them to stop trying to direct where the market goes and allow the market to direct itself in large ways with reasonable carve-out, just like any government does, of areas where they can't, where you don't allow foreign investment or you restrict it in some ways. Having dispute settlement for companies in China, I think, would be of value as well. This is, I think, a no-brainer for companies that a bit would benefit them. The good news for us is that part of the reason why these negotiations are about to restart is that China believes that a bit is in its interests as well by providing it further protections in the U.S. market. I think that we have a pretty good case to say that most foreign companies have pretty free access to this market, but there are some additional benefits that a bit would provide. And I think that's why these negotiations are important. But frankly, if we got a bit that looks like what the model looks like right now, I think we would have very strong footing, and it would make a significant difference for U.S. companies with the challenges they face in China.
Yes. Sergio?
I would like to answer to your question to me, but like also to comment on your answer and on your previous question. I think, and the quote that Claudio showed on Deng Xiaoping, I think is very important, because it say, okay, we are open to the market, but the kind of planned economy we have is the mainstream. And I think this is right, and I think this will continue to be so. I don't believe China will become a market as we conceive it. I don't believe China will be a democracy as we conceive it. They have a model of their own. I remember Danny Roderick's book, One Economy, Many Recipes. China is a different recipe for the market economy and for democracy, because they have a totally different origin. Their background is completely different from ours. If you allow me just an anecdote, I was coming from the airport this morning. It had been a long time I hadn't been in Washington, and I saw all these Greek buildings. And I said, this is very interesting. The US is perhaps the last country to pay tribute to our Greek heritage. That's our heritage. We are Greco-Romans. This is our history. China has nothing to do with that. The concept of democracy we have doesn't fit their concerns, their goals. So I don't think that we may have a kind of economic relation with China which is based on the same concept, the same ideas of market we have. They will continue. I'm sorry to say that. We suffer the same problem with China, because there's always the visible hand of the state behind whatever you do with China, instead of the invisible hand of the market. And they will continue, I think, to give the background and to intervene when they think they should. It's not because the rules say they have to intervene, no, it's because they think they should. Whether this is going to be good or bad for them, I don't know. Up until now, it has been good. I don't know for the future. If they can continue such strong emergency in all areas, keeping the basic structure. Of course, there will be changes, but it is adjustment, not a big change. Now, in the case of Brazil, I think that the increase in taxes for car imports was geared at China and affected other countries. There has been an adjustment of the rules, some qualifications, which I think have improved the situation. But I think we have to take into account one thing. We are in the context of a worldwide crisis. Each area, each region takes its defenses. We have suffered the impact of the monetary policies of Europe and of the United States. perhaps some measures that I don't agree with and that I think we didn't have before, perhaps they have been needed at the time in which our currency is continuously under threat of appreciation.
Okay, and final question goes to Peter Knight. Please, in the front here, Peter, to the other side, here.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all for your very insightful comments. My question is principally to Claudio Ambassador Amaral, in reference in particular to the Brazilian cartorial corporativista tradition to which there's been reference, and the barriers it imposes on Brazilian companies as well as international companies in Custo Brasil. There's been a fair amount of discussion about the, Sergio said, well, this is a problem for this government, meaning the Dilma government, a short to medium term problem. What is your view of the possibilities of the longer term and say the next Brazilian government to seriously attack the reforms in the area of labor, politics, infrastructure, etc.?
Okay, I'll say a few words and then I think Sergio say.
Easy question, come on.
Yeah. I guess we are caught, you know, there's a classical physics tells us something about any kind of body always looks to be rest. So we are, and there's a saddle effect. So the Brazilian economy, and in the sense of Brazilian society as well, is resting on a somewhat of a low-level equilibrium trap. Low-level growth trap, low-level investment trap. But the reason that's politically completely sustainable and the reason that the government has such high rates of approval, incredibly high rates of approval. President Dilma, in fact, has higher rates of approval than President Lula, who's a very popular president, as we all know. There are a number of, but one of them is the way the labor market is working in Brazil. That is a labor market that basically functions particularly well for the base of the pyramid. So if I like to look at numbers sometimes, and if you look at the growth of rate in wages and employment, and if you disaggregate by levels of education, for example, it turns out that the people that have made higher gains wage-wise, wages, salaries, income, and the people who have made a higher, where the employment has grown fast over the past 10 years, are the least educated. We call the base of the pyramid. Young people, this is why unemployment rate among young people is actually quite low. So in a situation where initial debt levels are fairly low, so credit expansion could grow very fast, number one, where people are making more money, and the people which are making more money are the most needed, okay? The result is that you have a fairly satisfied or self-satisfied society. Now, the flip side of this, and it's, which I think is fairly obvious, if the least educated are making more money, that means that productivity levels are growing very low, growing very at a very slow pace. So it turns out that our productivity gains over time are even lower than the US, and the US is a fairly mature economy. You might say, well, you know, you shouldn't be comparing with the US, but who are we going to compare? If we're going to compare with China, then we're way off the mark. So we're in a very interesting, I think, situation that we have a self-satisfied society at large, highly popular president, and with an economy which is not growing very fast, with a labor market that for a number of reasons, particularly the pattern of consumption, which is very much service-oriented, which transmits itself to the labor market, which is where unemployment rates are very low in Brazil. We're getting to a situation where in many cities unemployment is effective unemployment is zero. Of course, there's always transitional unemployment, but effective unemployment, open unemployment is zero, very close to that. So what are the incentives for things to change? It's, in a sense, it's the mirror image to the extent of China. Because again, the government doesn't have that many, it knows that it should change. But where are the incentives to change, the real incentives to change? Well, we know we have to get there, but what are the costs of the transition? It's not that the Brazilian government doesn't know it has to get there.
Yeah.
It does know. I mean, there's a lot of knowledge floating around. The question is, are we going to risk the transition? Sorry, this is
Sergio, last word.
Just to pick up on what you said, I think incentives for reform in China are higher than in Brazil. Why? Because the leadership has a goal. That's China becoming one of or the superpower. And they don't have to respond to society to keep in power. In the case of Brazil, we don't have a clear goal of being a superpower. I don't know exactly what our goal is. But the point is that even for people who are in government and who are aware that we need reform, the incentives for reform are very low. PT is a very professional party. PT people are professional in politics. They know quite well how to gain elections. I think that this is not the case of the next election in São Paulo. But the point is, reform would have a high political cost, and the people in government don't want to pay that cost. I think the Chinese can pay that cost. Why? Because they don't respond to electoral vote. There is a different process of legitimation for political structure. That's I think the big problem for Brazil. And it's not only the case of Brazil. In many other Latin American countries, there's a difference of degree, have realized that distribution of income is a very good way of keeping in power. Take the case of Venezuela, the case of Argentina. I'm not saying that Brazil is Venezuela's Argentina, but the distribution of income is very strong politically. And at a moment when you have the emergence of the poor, the emergence of social movements, this is something which has been in place for the last 20 years. The participation, economic and political participation, is very important for legitimacy and for elections. And the economic reforms will have a cost.
Well, Sergio, thank you very much. Before I thank you on the panel, I had this very special personal thanks to 6 people that helped us organize this and this event and helped us today. She is not here, she left, but Kelly Mayman, a colleague of Nelson's and a friend of Aaron, and a dear friend of mine, was very instrumental and as an advisor on this. Julia Dias-Leite from the council, from the Brazil-China Business Council, was also very much a part of organizing this discussion. To my colleagues here at the Wilson Center, Sandy from the Kissinger Institute, Michael from the Brazil Institute, Erica from the Canada Institute, and Natalie from the Brazil Institute for helping us today and prior setting up everything. And especially to you, Sergio, Aaron, Nelson, Claudio, and Richard, for sharing with us your knowledge about this very important subject. For you in the audience for coming, please keep looking at our website. We are going to have some very interesting events this month involving science in Brazil, scientific research in Brazil, with a discussion here on the February 23rd in the afternoon. We will be also at University of Toronto, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, at the West Virginia University. And write down this date, November 20th at 9 a.m. We are going to convene a discussion about 2 historic events that just took place in Brazil. One is a massive municipal election that went on without a flaw, electing 5,568 mayors and multiple of that in terms of city council members, and followed by a unprecedented decision on a criminal trial on corruption, political corruption in Brazil, at the Supreme Court, that ended up or is ending up with guilty verdicts affecting people that once occupied positions at the center of power, an event that, in my judgment, is a watershed event in Brazil and signals the growing intolerance of Brazilian society to impunity of people in high places that should be doing the people's business and not their business, their personal business. So we are going to have a panel on that, and it's, I think you will, if you are following Brazil, you should come here and participate in the discussion. With that, thank you very much for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo.
Thank you, Paulo.